Hello, and welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. Each episode, we talk about a particular topic in the life of a professor. We are tenure-track faculty members in the sciences, working at a primarily undergraduate university in California. The purpose of our podcast is reflection, so we bring something we think is working and something we're working on to discuss. Welcome to the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. I'm Claire, and today we're excited to bring you a special interview episode that was suggested by one of our listeners. So that gives me an opportunity to tell all you listeners out there that we welcome and love episode suggestions. I'd love to hear about any topic ideas you have, suggestions of people to interview, or ideas of related podcasts that we could maybe swap episodes or interviews with. So keep the suggestions coming, and you can reach us at contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. In today's episode, we are interviewing me about the choice and experience of working at a primarily undergraduate institution, PUI. This episode was suggested by our listener, Darien, and today we're extra excited because we actually have Darien in our virtual studio, and he will be asking the questions he wrote. Welcome to the show, Darien.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We're delighted to have you. Before we get going with the questions, will you just start out by telling us a bit about yourself and maybe why you thought about this topic?
Yes. So I am a PhD chemist. I got my PhD in 2020, and I'm now a postdoctoral researcher at a national lab. And I've been thinking for a while now about, the steps to take in my life following my PhD and like where I'm going with my life. And at the end of my PhD, I did not want to be a professor and was hoping to leave academia. But listening to this podcast over the last year, I have been struck by some of the joys and cool challenges of being a professor at a PUI and thinking about whether or not that is a job for me or not.
Awesome. I think that's a really interesting topic. I definitely thought a lot about it too, and I'm sure there's lots of people out there considering similar questions. So thank you for the great idea.
Yeah.
So I think you have a quote for us?
Yes. So my quote is my all-time favorite poem.
Ooh.
And this poem, really helped me in undergrad think about the difference between general chemistry and physical chemistry and how professors can kind of give different levels of explanation and models to their students. So I'll read you this poem by Emily Dickinson. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind.
Oh, that's so cool. The truth must, what was that last bit?
The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind.
Oh, I love it. That's really cool.
Yeah, so I was just always struck by how the things you learn in Gen Chem are very different, like conceptually, than the things you learn later in your career. But how if you had learned the later truths in full, you wouldn't have been able to process them.
Yeah, we keep building on things. I always love telling my students, like, okay, now we're going to throw out this assumption we didn't even know we were making and start thinking more deeply about it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that's just always amazed me at how different levels of explanation are so key.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Cool. Well, thank you. I love thinking about that poem with the lens of chemistry. So Thank you for that.
Yeah. So I have a bunch of questions.
Awesome.
To ask you in no particular order.
Okay.
So my first question is about going from a research-heavy PhD to a teaching-heavy job. So how was that transition for you? Was there anything that took you by surprise? Or was there anything that just like the differences between the jobs and your daily routine were very big?
Yeah, great question. So for me, that transition happened going from grad school to my current professor job. And So you're focusing on the switch from research-focused to teaching-focused. And initially, when I thought about this concept that you brought up, I didn't really think that transition was noticeable to me that much. But as I started thinking about the transition in general and going from grad school to being a professor and what things were a big deal, I kind of realized that most of them revolved around suddenly being in charge of my own class for the first time. So in grad school and even in undergrad, I was a teaching assistant quite a few times and a tutor, but I'd never had my own class until being a professor. So here were some of the things that struck me going from grad school to professor. And a main thing was that I was suddenly in charge of my class, of my research, of the format of my research group, the rules of my class, and just like how little oversight there was. So of course I needed to show up to lecture in labs, but no one told me how to set up my classes or my office hours or what the rules of the class were. My fellow analytical chemistry colleague did very generously give me his class notes and previous syllabi, and I stuck closely to those, but I didn't need to, and nobody was checking my classes to see what I covered each day or looking over my grading or anything, or telling me whether I should prepare for lecture or answer this email. It was just very exciting that it was all stuff I got to decide myself. But becoming comfortable taking charge was a big transition for me. And a lot of those things were questions that students would ask about what was allowed and what wasn't allowed in the class. Like, could they have more time on an assignment or could they make up a lab? And I just wasn't prepared to answer those questions. I hadn't expected them. I didn't have answers ready to go. I didn't even really know what I wanted my policy to be around those things. And at the same time, it was just wild that I could just decide what I thought was best and just make that the policy. And so after being surprised by those kind of questions a few times, one of my go-to techniques became thinking, what would a professor who knows what she's doing do? And then I would just do that. So I'd look back on my experience as a student myself, my favorite professor from when I was an undergrad. What would she say in this situation? Well, I'll say that. So that was helpful for getting through that. So yeah, the transition to being comfortable being a professor, I'm very comfortable with it now. But a couple other examples of that transition. I remember one time, my first semester as a professor, I was talking with a student who was going to take general chemistry in the spring, and I was teaching a section of general chemistry in the spring, and I almost said, maybe you'll be in my class. But I couldn't quite manage that phrasing. It just seemed too much like I was in charge. I couldn't really say, my class, even though it was my class. So I said, maybe we'll be in the same class, which wasn't accurate at all, but it felt like something that I could say, you know? And I also remember we had interviews for a new faculty member, and they were supposed to meet half an hour with all the current faculty members. And when the first one came, I was just completely embarrassed. Like, it just didn't make sense to me that I would be interviewing somebody for a professor position when I had just gotten there. And this person had more experience than I did because she'd already had a previous professor position. So it just seemed absurd that I would be obsessing her. And I got over that, thankfully, before the next candidate came, so it only happened once. But so yeah, just being a full member of the department, participating in decisions about hiring and prerequisites, etc., was just wild.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, go ahead.
So the job of being in charge of your syllabus and the likes was something that had to develop for you.
Yeah. I guess I just had to be comfortable that was my role.
Okay.
I had to become comfortable filling those shoes, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it just took a little bit of time. And I'm sure, some grad students and postdocs teach classes of their own, and so maybe some people get that experience before their professor positions. But just becoming in charge of my class and research and a full member of the department just took a little getting used to.
Yeah. It's really interesting to me in the sciences, a lot of times graduate students will TA a class or a lab, but not have any oversight of the syllabus. But I had a friend who was in graduate school in English and technical communication, and they taught like English 101, for instance, and they had complete and total oversight of their syllabi. So it's kind of interesting that it seems like different departments and fields have different policies about the amount of oversight and control and in chargeness you have as a grad student.
Totally, totally. And sometimes you're the TA and sometimes you're actually the instructor. And how do you get yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I agree. Different experiences.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious about the expectations and the, what pressures are placed on you as a PUI professor. So like,
Okay.
You and I both did our PhDs at like a research intensive institution where a lot of the expectations on a professor are to be prodigious researchers and have a lot of output. But as a PUI, your goal is to kind of help build complex humans, and teach these
like
topics. So, have you had any have you had a hard time or anything interesting come up when you switched from the goal being, research / papers to my goal is to be a teacher and a scholar to these specific students in front of me?
Totally, totally. Yeah, great question. Let's see. So I appreciated and still appreciate that although the research expectations are much lower at my PUI than at our one universities, there's also enthusiasm and support for me to go beyond, the baseline levels. And I kind of appreciate that that's a bonus rather than a requirement. I applied for this position and was kind of aiming for a PUI in my career search, in my job search. So it didn't surprise me when I discovered that that was the balance here. And I also went to a PUI for undergrad, so maybe I had some extra experience of what kind of those universities were like. So I wouldn't say it surprised me, but there are some colleagues that started at similar times to me, so I happen to know them, and they were really focused in research, and it just wasn't a good match for them to be here, and they eventually went off to have research-focused careers elsewhere. So I would just say it's a different mindset. Like I was just thinking, we had seminars recently, and so we have a seminar series as well at our university, but it's mostly the undergraduates give seminars, and it's part of their senior capstone. And we often have seminars given by faculty at our university too, or other universities as part of the seminar series, like before we get to the undergrad part. But I guess what I want to emphasize is that it's just an example of how it's a different focus. In those seminars, we're not trying to get the fanciest person to come and communicate the most groundbreaking concepts to other experts, where instead we're talking about real research, but we're focusing on giving the undergraduates the experience of seeing that research and communicating the science and research experience to them. So, yeah, I guess I wouldn't say I had culture shock, except for maybe just like a couple things did come up. So, it's just a lot slower to get the research done when you're not working with anybody who spends their full time on it. And I still feel a bit guilty if I let myself for not being as prolific in my research as my colleagues at our one universities. But I really appreciate the benefits of the primarily undergraduate institution, and it was an intentional choice. And so one thing that happens sometimes is meeting a colleague from an R1, and the colleague maybe assumes that the PUI is a step down. So like my colleague at Berkeley said, you could make it at Berkeley, and he was encouraging me to apply for this position in Berkeley. And I really appreciate his confidence and that he would encourage me to join his department. But for me, it wasn't a step down to go to a PUI, and it wasn't that I didn't think I could make it at an R1. It was that I wanted to focus on teaching while continuing to do the research at the moderate level. I wanted to spend lots of time on my classes and be in a department that supported that. And I also wanted to get NSF grants and other grants for research, and it appealed to me that it would be supported and people would be excited about it, but the expectations of the degree and speed and all that would be a little bit smaller so that I could focus on the teaching. So I think it's all about what makes you happy, and for me that was a PUI. And I think that can be a culture shock, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay. How is the way you chose research topics and managed research topics changed since, leaving graduate school and going to a PUI. So like, as a grad student, you build projects on the year time scale and you devote, 40, 50 hours a week to projects, where now you have to parse projects into like little time chunks for students.
Yeah.
So like how have your projects changed?
Yeah, good question. I guess instead of thinking about year time scales, I'm thinking about summer chunks, and because that's when I and my students can spend more time on it. And also, I've really started thinking about the type of work involved in the questions that I want to answer, and which questions that I want to answer, which research questions do I have might be doable for a student just starting research. Because a lot of the go-to questions that I work on are the kind where you need a lot of training to be able to start analyzing samples without contaminating them. And so that's not really conducive to students getting in the lab and being hands-on and getting the data for me. And so yeah, I've started thinking about which projects involve analytical techniques that they could get involved with more easily. And so that we can get them in the lab and they can be getting the data, and they love to be in the lab and I love for them to get the data. So yeah, the more that they can be doing that, the better. So I've kind of been thinking about that a little bit. I still have, projects where it's either going to be me or a highly trained undergraduate doing some of the work, but I've just been thinking about that as I'm coming up with new projects. Yeah.
How much time are you able to actually devote to lab work?
Great question. Not much. At the end of last semester, I took finals week, which is usually kind of a light week for the faculty, and did a bunch of lab work in that week, and I think the following week, and then was able to get a chunk of lab work that needed to get done in those couple weeks. And, summer times I can usually get chunks of work done, but in the semester, it would be more like helping students do small chunks that they can do during the semester, and I'm hopefully trying to come up with a small piece of a bigger project that they can work on in the semester, but it's quite minimal, the amount of time that I spend on research during the semester. Mm-hmm.
Do you, so like as a postdoc, it's expected of me that I will have command of the literature, and that I will know how to write papers, and that I know how to analyze data of the type that's required for the projects that I undertake. But I would think that for undergraduates, I think all those assumptions probably have to go out the window. Mm-hmm. So how much time do you spend like teaching undergraduates data interpretation skills, data management skills, literature reading skills, versus how much of those aspects do you just do yourself for the projects?
Yeah, sure. Great question. I love that phrasing. So I would say that I still take a commanding role with interpreting data and writing the manuscripts. And I've thought about whether I should start putting postdocs into my research proposals to kind of get more experienced help with those sides, but I haven't done that yet. I think that could be fun. But so far, it's just been me and my undergrads. How much do I teach them about interpretation? And I more what I do is I throw them in and see if they can come up with something helpful, So a lot of times I say, okay, we've got this data set. We're working on interpreting it. How about you look at this part, see what you can come up with? And I leave it kind of open-ended, and I hope that a lot of times it does happen that they come back with something totally unexpected. Like I would never have thought to look at a book on land organisms to figure out this question I had about the ocean, but they did and came up with something interesting that I wouldn't have found. So that's awesome. A lot of the time, they look around and they don't find anything particularly significantly contributing to the project, but I still think it's useful for them to have done that they get a little bit better idea of how the research goes, and there was always the chance that they would have found something really useful. So I kind of like, that's been my technique a lot with data interpretation. But then, yeah, so like for my sabbatical, which we just applied for sabbatical, and I'm planning to kind of take a bunch of projects that we got to the point of pretty far interpreted, but not finished interpreted and definitely not published. I want to take a bunch of those over the finish line when I have more dedicated time myself. So I think I would like to involve the undergraduates in all these steps as much as possible, but I do think there's a bunch of the final push of getting it over the finish line, I think, is something that I haven't yet figured out how to involve them in.
Yeah. Sometimes those pushing over the finish line can be hard, even when you have very skilled colleagues. It can be very hard to figure out how to dice up the project into pieces that are manageable by different people. So I guess what I'm saying is for the pushing over the finish line, I wonder how much that's just a like solitary thing versus a undergrad thing.
That's a good point. It is, yeah, you're right. In grad school as well, it was, I mean, of course, those were my papers, but it was mostly a solitary thing as well. Good point. Cliffhanger. We're going to do this episode in 2 parts, so tune in next week for the grand conclusion, where Darien asks questions more about the interplay between research and teaching, and we talk also about teaching philosophies.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Professor Podcast with Ruth and Claire. We're delighted to have you as a listener, and we would love to hear from you. And if you want to email us, our address is contactprofessorpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any of your suggestions for future shows or professor quotes that you might want to share with us, or even just things that have come up for you when you were listening to previous episodes. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, we would love if you would spread the word. So the best way to spread word is by telling people you know if you think they should listen to it, or you can leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.